And we got 2 weeks to go. You can make it. We were talking about the Kennedy administration. No idea what all, but that's why. Talking about the Kennedy administration, and as I pointed out, most of his challenges tended to be in foreign affairs. And most of those tended to be focused on the Cold War. But that doesn't mean he's not dealing with domestic issues. In fact, sometimes he's juggling a domestic crisis and a foreign crisis at the same time. If you recall the sit-in movements that led to Dr. King getting incarcerated, that led to John Kennedy contacting Coretta Scott King and all that, well, the sit-ins produced a lot of results, actually. One, they helped desegregate over 100 lunch counters in the South in various cities, not in one city. Now, the students that had organized the sit-ins had some help from the NAACP, but they didn't want to get subsumed by that organization. And they became convinced, largely because of the director of the SCLC, one of the leading women in the civil rights movement, Ella Baker. She convinced the students they would be better off if they formed their own civil rights organization. Now, during the sit-ins to coordinate everything, they had created a temporary committee, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And since that's a lot to say at once, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, almost overnight, everybody started calling it SNCC. So that's what it became known as. And their first chairman was Marion Barry, the future mayor of Washington, D.C. Probably their most famous chairman is now a congressperson from Atlanta, John Lewis. He's in the news a lot. With the creation of SNCC, all of the major civil rights organizations that will play a part in the civil rights crusade are now organized and in place. Doesn't mean they always play nice with each other. Keep in mind, the civil rights movement is an umbrella movement. All these organizations want roughly the same thing, but they sometimes have different ways about going about it. The Urban League, for example, is relatively conservative. NAACP and Southern Christian leadership tend to be rather moderate. The real radicals, activists, tend to come from SNCC and CORE. They're going to be the advocates of direct action. Good morning. Talking about the civil rights movement. So keep in mind, they all want the same thing, but it's not necessarily, good morning. It's not necessarily a single unified group. It's a coalition. And though Dr. King is viewed by much of America as the leader of the movement, good morning, the other leaders also see themselves as the leader of the movement. Roy Wilkins, for example, of the NAACP, good morning. I was joking on how empty these rows were. You guys came and filled them up. That's good. So SNCC and CORE will tend to favor more confrontational tactics, more direct action, where the SCLC and the NAACP understand the need for politics, for legal action, for getting public opinion on your side. So the organizations all bring strengths to the movement, but sometimes it also causes friction. Now, why is SNCC in particular the organization that produces many of the demonstrators? Why do you think that's the case? Why the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? That's part of it. Yeah. They're too young to know exactly what they're getting into.
And because they're young.
And because they're young, yeah. So you folks have a lot less to lose at your stage in life. If you, for example, get arrested and thrown in jail in Mississippi, someone my age has a lot to lose. So older people tend to be more hesitant about putting themselves on the line. You guys are young, you're fired up, you're still rather idealistic, I hope. You're slightly naive, you don't have any idea what you're getting into normally. That can be a good thing. It can be dangerous, but it can be a good thing too. So you guys actually make the perfect demonstrators, believe it or not. Now, a good example of direct action and the frustration the Kennedy administration has early with the civil rights movement are the so-called freedom rides. In May of 1961, integrated groups of protesters, mostly from SNCC and CORE, and led to a large degree by John Lewis of SNCC, board buses and leave Washington, D.C. to travel through the South. Doesn't sound like any big deal, does it? Well, down south, the transportation system is segregated. There had been an earlier set of freedom rides in the late 1940s, and they had helped desegregate the North and part of the Upper South. So this was a new set of freedom rides to try and desegregate the rest of the South. Now, it's perfectly legal until they enter Virginia, which, by the way, obviously is right next to D.C. They really don't have much trouble in the upper north. It's when they get down south that they begin to have real problems. Now, the Kennedy administration had contacted the governor of Alabama, John Patterson, and he had promised them that the protesters would not be harmed. They get down to Alabama, and on the 14th of May, 1961, outside of Anniston, Alabama, the buses are attacked by the Ku Klux Klan with the acquiescence of the local police. One of the buses is turned over and set on fire while the protesters are still in it, I might add. Luckily, they all get out alive. Here's the route of the Freedom Riders. Here's Anniston right here. And that's just the beginning of their problems. And here's the Freedom Riders bus that was attacked. Robert Kennedy was incensed, and he actually called the bus company and demanded they do something. When the guy said there's not much we can do, he goes, well, damn it, get Mr. Greyhound on the phone. And they'd point out to him that there was no Mr. Greyhound. Happy with the name of the company. The Kennedy administration is sympathetic to the Freedom Riders, but they're also somewhat peeved at them for provoking a crisis. And remember, that was one of the tactics of the freedom movement. You know, they realized the Southern governments aren't going to act, so you've got to create some sort of crisis or emergency to force the federal government to act. So the Kennedys weren't exactly, they support the cause, they're not thrilled about the way they're going about it. They try and negotiate with Patterson again. And again, Patterson promises them there'll be no problems. On the 20th of May, the riders pull into the Montgomery bus terminal, and they are immediately attacked by white racists. Hundreds of them were waiting for them, and the police again stand nearby and simply watch the event. Following day, instead of prosecuting any of the attackers, they arrest 300 of the protesters, including 14 Catholic priests. We know how dangerous they can be. Actually, it's not the priests that are dangerous, it's the nuns. If you ever went to a Catholic school, you know that's true. Kennedy is running out of patience, and Robert Kennedy sends in 600 federal marshals to restore order. And even this, in a way, is a bit of a concession to the South. Kennedy at first wanted to send in uniformed troops, but even going back to the days of Reconstruction, that created a bad image in the South. So they decided to send in the federal marshals. They're plain clothes, and better than that, they have the ability to arrest somebody. Military can put you under detention, but unless there's martial law, they can't arrest anybody. Federal marshals can. In May to mid-September, hundreds of freedom riders are arrested, but because of the presence of the federal marshals, there's less violence. The Kennedy administration is trying to find a solution to this. Keep in mind, there's only so much the federal government can do. States have their rights. And as long as federal law is not violated, there's little the federal government can do. But King and Robert Kennedy came up with a rather unique solution. The Interstate Commerce Commission earlier had issued a ruling that segregation on public transport was illegal. So they simply got the courts to uphold that ruling in September. And through the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the courts, segregation on public transportation was deemed illegal anywhere under any reason. So the Freedom Riders accomplished their goal. They desegregate the transportation system in the South. And they also begin to pull the movement more towards direct action. After this, you see more of that from Dr. King's organization, from the NAACP, even some of it from the Urban League. So it starts pulling them more towards direct action, confrontational tactics. Now that's it. One thing the Kennedys don't want. They're still under the illusion they can work with, quote, moderate Southern governors. It's really a false belief because none of them are particularly moderate. They're all dedicated racists. And sooner or later, the Kennedys are going to run out of patience with them. But at this point, they're still trying to find peaceful solutions that don't involve direct confrontation. So one of the things they came up with, it would help the movement in a very positive way, and also move the movement away from violence, they hoped, was the Voter Education Project, the VEP. The federal government provided funds to civil rights organizations, particularly SNCC, to send volunteers out through the South to register voters, and also to run voter education schools. Keep in mind, a lot of Southern states had voting tests and citizenship tests to determine your right to vote. And it was considered legal because technically, if your great-grandparents couldn't vote in, let's say, Mississippi, you had to take the test. So if you're a white and you move into Mississippi, and your grandparents hadn't lived there, you had to take the test. But since almost no African American, their grandparents could vote, they all had to take the test. And they were extremely difficult. I occasionally teach a course on the civil rights movement. And one of the fun things I like to do is inflict the Alabama citizenship test on my students. See how many of you folks get to vote. I'm a trained historian. I've taught political science in the past as well. And I barely passed the damn thing. Routinely, in most of my classes, virtually nobody would pass it. How many of you folks know the exact square miles of the District of Columbia? That's one right there you're going to miss, right? I mean, they're kind of, some of them also reference really arcane passages of the Alabama Constitution, which you're supposed to interpret and give court cases that support it. How many people know that, for example?
68.34 square miles.
I knew that. No, I knew it was around 70. I didn't know it was, and they couldn't Google things back then. Yeah. But thank you.
Well,
If anybody's curious, they know now.
now you know.
What'd you learn in history today? How big the District of Columbia is. That wasn't even on the agenda. Now, what the Kennedys are quickly discovering is even peaceful efforts to desegregate the South or raise voter awareness, something most people would consider to be, American, patriotic. We all should vote. Let me reemphasize that. We all should vote. If you're not registered, please do. Make your voice heard. The VEP faces tremendous violence in the South. Their headquarters in many cities and towns is firebombed. The demonstrators are routinely roughed up by the Klan. A couple of the headquarters suffered drive-by shootings, shotgun blasts through the front window. So again, this kind of re-emphasizes to a lot of the black activists that, peaceful organization isn't working. And it also leads to growing frustration among the Kennedy administration with a lot of these Southern white governments. They don't seem to be willing to change at all. Having said that, though, by the end of 1962, the civil rights movement was largely stalled. It had kind of reached a low point. Remember, I pointed out these organizations, there was often friction between them. And in particular, between the NAACP and SNCC. And it all comes together in Albany, Georgia. There was a local civil rights organization there, and they invited SNCC in and the NAACP to help. And instead of working together, they became rivals. The organizers, both organizations sent into Albany, worked against each other. To make matters worse, when they decided to launch a citywide demonstration, their goals were too grandiose: immediate desegregation of the entire city, which in a fair universe would have been right, but ain't gonna happen in Georgia in 1962. And they really had no plan for accomplishing this. And worse than that, they actually ran into an intelligent Southern police chief, Laurie Pritchett. Pritchett was very intelligent and very astute. By the way, as far as racists go, he wasn't one of the worst. Don't get me wrong, he was a racist, but he wasn't a fire-breathing, foaming at the mouth type. Ah, here it goes. That's great. He had studied the civil rights movement. He understood the methods of direct action and realized as long as he kept things nonviolent publicly, he could diffuse the situation. So he ordered his police, they illegally arrested the protesters, don't get me wrong, but they did it non-violently. That doesn't mean he didn't use violence. There was some used back in the jail, away from the cameras, but he knew how to steer the movement away from confrontation. Dr. King, they finally call in the SCLC to try and fix the situation, which, by the way, did not help, because then both the NAACP and SNCC were now furious at Dr. King, because they came in and said, look, the pros are here, you guys botched it, we're going to fix it. Even King couldn't fix this one. He gets himself arrested, and Pritchett secretly arranges for him to get bailed out. Didn't want King in jail. Dr. King gets arrested again. Determined. And Pritchett can't immediately arrange another secret patron to bail him out. So he leaves his cell door unlocked and open and allows people to come and go. That doesn't exactly help Dr. King's case, does it? Eventually, King will leave Albany with nothing more than a vague promise to study desegregation. The so-called Albany movement is a huge failure. Another problem the movement's facing is competition. Throughout African American history, the struggle for black rights has largely come down to three ideologies, but we don't need to worry about accommodation in here. That was basically accept things and sooner or later they're changed. But the struggle largely revolved around two different ideologies. One is the civil rights movement, the movement towards integration and full rights. The other is the Black nationalist movement. Black nationalists tend to be separatists. They don't believe white society can ever get along peacefully with African Americans, and they strive to construct their own society. Probably the most famous of the early Black nationalists was Marcus Garvey. And his movement, basically the Garveyites and all that, they had their own stores, their own restaurants, their own schools, their own tailors, their own undertakers. They were basically trying to create a society separate from whites, equal but separate. By the early 1960s, Black nationalism was becoming very popular among very frustrated African Americans, especially young urban African Americans. More so in places like New York, Philadelphia, than places like Montgomery. One of the reasons is the charismatic spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, what a lot of white people call the Black Muslims. Their spokesperson was a former convict named Malcolm Little, who, while he was in prison, learned about the nation, gained religion, became a reformed individual, and changed his name to Malcolm X. The X represents his lost heritage due to slavery. By the way, his transformation was amazing. He went from being a street thief and a pimp to getting religion. And after he got out of prison, he was easily one of the most honest, decent human beings in the world. Was married, was a dedicated family man, was not the least bit corrupt or dishonest after that. So it really transformed him. He's actually an amazing person. If you study his life, the growth he went through, that he really transcended a lot of his earlier pain and poverty. He is extremely attractive to young African Americans. And SNCC, slowly, as the 60s goes on, will gravitate more and more to Black nationalism and eventually become a Black nationalist organization. So the mainstream civil rights organizations feel competition from the more radical Black nationalists. If they don't accomplish the goal, the average African American will lose faith in them and possibly gravitate towards figures like Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X. So Dr. King and the leadership need to revive the movement and come up with a huge victory. And they have strategy sessions on this. And they decide to target the city of Birmingham, Alabama. And Birmingham was the perfect target. It was easily, if not the most racist, one of the most racist cities in America. There were so many Klan firebombings there that the Black community nicknamed it Bombingham. And the local police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connors. Connors was perfect. He was like an attack dog. He lacked Pritchett's intelligence and insight, and it was guaranteed he would react with violence and brutality. And by the way, he didn't disappoint. Just changing the city itself would be a huge victory. They hope this could be a transcending moment for the nation. And there's another reason they picked Birmingham. It already had a very strong chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and its leader, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, was emerging as one of the great civil rights leaders. Does that name sound familiar? It should. He ended up getting chased out of Alabama because of his civil rights activities. He accepted a pastorship here in Cincinnati and spent the last 30 some odd years of his life as a religious leader and civil rights organizer here in Cincinnati. And I had the great pleasure of meeting him more than once over the years before he died. Oh, here's the guy that could count on to react with violence and brutality, Eugene Bull Connor. Now, Albany was how to screw up a civil rights crusade. Birmingham is how to do it right. It's a textbook case, in case any of you folks ever want to start some sort of civil rights crusade or something. This is a textbook case for you folks. To begin with, they even have a code name for it. It's called Project C. You know what the C stands for? You're not going to Google it? I'm just kidding. Let me check real quick. Project Confrontation. They start with clear demands. They want an immediate end to segregation at the lunch counters. Birmingham was one of the few cities where the sit-ins did not work. They wanted desegregation of public facilities, which, by the way, meant things like City Hall and public parks, the things they were paying taxes to support but weren't allowed to use. And the appointment of a biracial committee to study further integration. Now, are these radical demands? No, there's something the city could easily meet. They start with demonstrations and sit-ins at the lunch counters. And they also add an economic boycott. That's something else they learned over the years. You may not change the hearts and minds of Southern governments, but you can sure convince Southern business people that maybe this is a good idea, especially when they start losing a lot of money. And the Black community also learned to launch boycotts of like downtown businesses and all that in spring before Easter. You know why? Because it's a huge holiday, it was anyway, in the Black community. Many African Americans, especially down south, would save up months to buy an Easter outfit and other accoutrements for it. So you're talking about a lot of economic buying power that now is going to be steered away from white businesses to African American businesses. On the 6th of April, Reverend Shuttlesworth and 50 protesters are arrested. And as expected, Bull Connors is getting increasingly violent. He's going to use attack dogs, fire hoses, and electric cattle prods. I made a mistake once when I was teaching over NKU many, many years ago, trying to get across to people how painful something like that would be Anybody ever been tasered? Don't need to admit why. I made the mistake asking my class, I said, do any of you folks know what it's like to get hit with a cattle prod? And one girl in the class goes, I do. And I was almost afraid to ask her why. Turns out she grew up on a farm with 4 brothers. That explained it, doesn't it? But I was wondering, how did you end up getting cattle prod used on you? Mean old brothers. But if you haven't, if you've never been tased or had something like that, you've had a bad shock, haven't you? You have, yeah. That gives you some idea. And if you've ever been hit with a fire hose, that'll knock you clear across the room. Literally. Little secret, it's not necessarily the water that puts out the fire, it's the pressure. But you can, at close range, you can peel somebody's skin off with a fire hose. So it's nothing to laugh about. But Connors gets increasingly violent. He turns police dogs loose on him. And I don't blame the dog. There's no such thing as a bad dog, just bad owners. On the 12th of April, Dr. King is arrested in Birmingham, and that was planned. One of the other things they had learned was that some of the more public figures, such as Dr. King, should get publicly arrested. That brings publicity. But you have an administrative team, a leadership team behind the scenes. So Dr. King gets arrested, that doesn't mean the SCLC's leadership or leaderless. Bayard Rustin, Reverend Abernathy, others are leading the organization, and that's planned. Unlike Pritchett, who makes sure King gets out of jail immediately, Connors throws away the key. Even denies Dr. King writing material. Doesn't work. A trustee smuggles in a pencil and some paper. When he can't write out on paper, he actually uses toilet paper. And then has it smuggled out of the jail. It's one of the great documents of the civil rights movement. It's known as a letter from the Birmingham jail. And by the way, it kind of shocked Birmingham authorities when all of a sudden it's published on the front page of many national newspapers. They had no idea Dr. King had even smuggled it out. In it, Dr. King makes one of the greatest pleas in the world for the immediate end of segregation. He points out that too many leaders advocate gradualism. And gradualism means never. He also points out, as he will in the future, and as he did in the past, African Americans are just looking for their just rights as American citizens. Nothing more, nothing less. Like I said, it becomes one of the historic statements of the civil rights movement and brings a lot of publicity to bear to his incarceration in Birmingham. And here's police using attack dogs and hosing of demonstrators in Birmingham. These guys are actually being nice, shooting over the head a little bit. Kennedy's getting extremely angry with these Southern governments. He's publicly sympathetic. In a newscast, he announced that the events in Birmingham, quote, made him sick and stated, "I am not asking for patience. I can well understand why the Negroes of Birmingham are tired of being asked to be patient." He states that there's actually little he can do as president to intervene, but as I pointed out, he's privately outraged and again puts his brother, the Attorney General, on the case. And Bobby Kennedy sent several of his key people down there to try and force an agreement. But again, this has to be done quietly behind the scenes. Now, Project C is going to reach its most controversial point in the first days of May. Dr. King ups the ante by calling for a, quote, children's crusade. Young people under the age of 18 to march peacefully through the streets of Birmingham. Dr. King didn't think, even he didn't think, that somebody like Bull Connors would be evil enough to attack children. Guess what? He was. Fire hoses, attack dogs, clubbings. Each day, hundreds of children march, they get arrested, and I don't know how many of you are parents out there, but how'd you like to see your kid hit with a fire hose or attack dog or arrested? You get kind of angry, wouldn't you? The parents are growing angry, and there's a threat of riot starting to get violent, something Dr. King didn't want, by the way. In fact, by this point, it's angry mobs confronting the police, and violence breaks out every day. The break finally comes on the 7th of May in an unlikely place. The events in Birmingham were getting a lot of not only national, but international publicity. But again, according to that great Southern tradition of ignoring events in the Black community, this wasn't even front page news in Birmingham. So it was quite a shock to a delegation of Birmingham businessmen who happened to be in Tokyo trying to convince Japanese businesses to invest in Alabama. They picked up the front page of the English language Tokyo Times, and what do they see on the front page? Birmingham. It's an international embarrassment. And by the way, it doesn't do their trade delegation any good. Yeah, you want to invest in our city? This is what's happening there. That's a good selling point, isn't it? So it's the business community that is finally going to be brought to act as intermediaries. The Kennedy administration gets the leading businesses of Birmingham to set up a front group, largely retired businessmen, to come up with a plan to present to the city to end the crisis. The city, throughout this, has refused to directly negotiate with the civil rights movement. By the way, it's known as the Senior Citizens Committee because they're retired businessmen. 3 days later, on the 10th, an agreement is reached. By the way, while all this was going on, there was even controversy on who was running the city of Birmingham. The good people of that town had enough with Bull Connors and his type, and they voted him out of office And Connors and his supporters originally refused to leave. They were contesting the vote, and eventually they lost in court and had to vacate. But an agreement is reached. The city agrees to desegregate the lunch counters and drinking fountains and to non-discriminatory hiring practices. And they form a biracial committee to plan for the future. And in return, the SCLC agrees to phase in the changes, the reforms. Birmingham has a ripple effect throughout the nation. 50 other southern cities decide that they don't want to go through this, and they quickly agree to desegregation plans. Doesn't mean things always go smoothly or quickly, but this is tremendous progress. Connors and his faction obviously denounced the agreement, and that night over 1,000 Klansmen hold a rally and burn a cross. Dr. King's motel and his brother's home, his brother was a leading minister in Montgomery, were both bombed. Luckily, no one was hurt. By the way, that was typical during the Montgomery bus boycott. Years earlier, Dr. King's home had been bombed. Word gets out about the bombings, and an already tense and angry Black community riot. King and the SCLC leaders try and calm down the community, but they're even shocked by the bitterness and anger that pervades the Black community, especially young African Americans in Birmingham. By the way, part of it was generational. When they heard of the rioting, they went out that night and started going to a lot of places where young Blacks were hanging out. They're all dressed in business suits. They really didn't have much of a connection with young America that way. They were pretty much reflective of an older generation. There's another result from Montgomery. Kennedy's patience was finally exhausted. He had tried working with the Southern governors and Southern mayors, most of whom I want to point out were at least then Democrats. And no matter what he did, he ran into violence and confrontation. In May, during the Freedom Rides, he had tried to work with Alabama Governor John Patterson, and we saw how that worked out. In October of 1962, they had an agreement with the governor of Mississippi to integrate the University of Mississippi. Ross Barnett had publicly promised them there'd be no trouble. James Meredith, who, by the way, was an honor student at another college and a Korean War veteran, showed up for admission and was blocked by state police. Eventually, a confrontation erupts. 2 people are killed. And the Kennedy administration is forced to integrate the University of Mississippi at Bayonet. In May of 1963, the governor of Georgia, George Wallace, refuses admission to the University of Alabama to 2 African American students. By the way, Wallace was considered a pretty vicious racist, but he was more of a racial opportunist than anything else. He had started his political career in Georgia as a liberal politician. He worked for one of the more liberal governors down there, who had favored integration and brought African Americans into his administration. And Wallace, when he ran for office himself, lost to a rabid segregationist. And Wallace replied, and excuse my French, this is a direct quote, that he wasn't going to be, quote, out-niggered by anybody anymore. And from that point on, Wallace became a champion of segregation and racial hatred. But he was no idiot. He had already cut a deal with federal marshals. He could make his little spiel in the, quote, schoolhouse door, as it becomes known. And then it was agreed he would get out of the way and the students could go on with their lives and, go to class. But still, it shows you how far a lot of these Southern governors are willing to go. There's going to be a transformation in the Kennedy administration regarding the civil rights movement. And since you guys are eager to start your weekend, I'll finish this up on Monday. Have a good day, folks. Have a good weekend.